So yeah, it's Ziblatt, my co-author.
Everyone, it's Ryan Lizza with TELUS News here with Steve Levitsky. We had a little technical issues. I apologize for that. We're starting at 3 instead of 2:45. Stephen, thank you for joining me and for bearing with me during that difficult 15 minutes for us.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Steve is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's best known, I assume, to our audience as the co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, their 2018 bestseller. And he also published in 2023, they also published Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. Recently, in February, Steve, you published an essay that got an enormous amount of attention that we'll talk about a lot today, The Path to American Authoritarianism, What Comes After Democratic Breakdown. And that was with Lucan A. Way. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. That was your piece in Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much. I know you're in high demand, so thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Let's start with your history on the subject. Obviously, when you're in high demand, it's never good for a country. When your expertise, this term competitive authoritarianism that now everyone knows in a way that they knew the name of your 2008 book, How Democracies Die. I want to talk a little bit about the history of it. You coined it back in 2002
Right.
in the Journal of Democracy, and you wrote another book in 2010 where you talked about it. That was long before you ever applied it to the American scene. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us about that early history of developing this idea of competitive authoritarianism, and then before we sort of get to the point where you're like, wait a second, now it's happening here.
Sure. First of all, I have to say we coined this term in 25 years ago, and we spent almost a decade writing that book, and never during that time imagined that we'd be applying the concept to the United States. The book was very much a focus on post-Cold War political regimes. During the Cold War, the vast majority of regimes were either democracies or outright, good old-fashioned dictatorships, military dictatorships, communist single-party regimes. There were not all that many hybrids. There were a few, but only after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Cold War, when Western-style liberal democracy was really the only game in town, and the United States and Europe were the world's dominant military, economic, and ideological powers. During that period, the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a proliferation of political regimes that adopted the formal architecture of democracy. They held competitive elections. They allowed legal opposition, but in various ways, incumbent abuse tilted the playing field against opposition. There were a bunch of these regimes emerged in Africa, a bunch of them emerged in the former Soviet Union, a few of them in Eastern Europe, Taiwan, Mexico, Serbia was under Milosevic was such a case. So this was very much a post-Cold War phenomenon of regimes that mixed really elements of competitive democracy with authoritarianism. And so Luke and I wrote a book about why these regimes proliferated, and looked at why some of them end up democratizing and others do not. And again, we were asked occasionally whether the United States could ever fit this category, and we basically spent a decade laughing it off, saying that no, this was highly unlikely in the United States. I never ever imagined applying it to the U.S.
And just to back up, because just to set this up, just step back and define competitive authoritarianism.
Sure. Competitive authoritarian regimes are regimes in which there are competitive elections in which the opposition can compete not only legally, but meaningfully for power. So these are not facade regimes. These are regimes where the opposition thinks it has a chance to win, where the incumbent loses sleep the night before the election, where there's truly some uncertainty about election outcomes, but in which the incumbent abuse of state power systematically tilts the playing field against the opposition. So in competitive authoritarian regimes, competition is real, but it's unfair. It's a hybrid political regime.
One of the things that you and other scholars on the subject point out is that there's no single point at which a democracy tips over into something else, authoritarian regime, a competitive authoritarian regime. What's the point for you, though, where you felt comfortable applying this label?
That's a good question, because abuse of power occurs in any democracy. There are you look back as far as Nixon defined weaponization of the machinery of government. Many, in fact, almost all of the things that the Trump administration is doing, you can find precedent for it in U.S. history. So, at what point does a regime cross the line? And frankly, when you have there are always borderline cases where that are subject to dispute. Well, some observers will think it's on one side of the line and others on another. There's no exact science to it.
Yeah.
For us, what we decided was the most useful metric was the cost of public opposition. In a
Mm,
democracy, legal and peaceful opposition, whether it is organizing a protest or joining a protest or giving money to an opposition candidate or writing an op ed against the government, that should be relatively costless. And so it's only in authoritarian regimes where peaceful legal opposition comes with a risk of government retribution. And so when many citizens have to think twice about engaging in legal and peaceful opposition because they fear some risk of government retribution, then I think that's a pretty good indicator that you've crossed the line. It might be a pretty soft authoritarianism still. For example, in the United States, those who oppose the government don't risk prison, they don't risk death, they don't risk exile, at least not yet. But for now, hundreds of thousands of Americans, there is some fear of, will I be audited? Will I be investigated? Will my institution be investigated or targeted for government retribution? Will my organization or institution face a lawsuit for political reasons? The weaponization of the machinery of government and its deployment to threaten, to harass, to bully, to punish business, media owners, universities, civic organizations, foundations, politicians on both sides of the aisle. That's now systematic enough that I'm comfortable calling where we are a sort of soft version of competitive authoritarianism.
I want to ask you to go back to How Democracies Die. And so much of that book were case studies in other countries that successfully thwarted populist authoritarian movements. And you provided in that book, I haven't read it in a little bit, but correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of rules of the road for preventing the rise of a movement, like the MAGA movement. And with the benefit of hindsight now, what did the two parties, what did the media, what did elites in both parties, how did they fuck this up? How did they, what a, because I remember thinking at the time, like, oh wow, Levitsky's writing about, how people on the far left need to be really comfortable joining in a coalition with people on the center right. And that's not happening in the United States. This is stuff I remember thinking at the time. And you had a lot of very specific prescriptive things like that. And what did elites? How did they mess up the rise of this movement? What could they have done differently?
So I think, I mean, one can find responsibility across the board, and happy to talk about any aspect of this. I assign the bulk of the responsibility to the Republican Party elite, to those in the conservative world, many figures in Republican and conservative politics who know better and who, in private, fear and despise Donald Trump and dislike the MAGA movement, but who refused to take the steps necessary to thwart it. Um, One obvious example is the Stop the Steal movement. The vast majority of elected Republican officials either parroted Trump's claims or just remained silent, refused to come out and do what small d Democratic politicians do after an election, which is publicly accept the results, congratulate the winner, and move on. Very few Republicans publicly accepted the results of the 2020 election, which helped to uh, deliver a real blow to the legitimacy of the electoral process. After January 6th, the U.S. I mean, if there was ever a moment in U.S. history that was for which the institution of impeachment and conviction were designed, it was for Donald Trump after January 6th. And Republican officials knew that. And they said so, many of them in public, some of them in private. But they opted not to convict Trump and to rule him out of the next election. Republican officials knew, and many of them worried about it a lot in private. They knew Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. It wasn't a speculation like when we wrote How Democracies Die. He had tried to overturn an election and block a peaceful transfer of power, and yet was virtually unanimously nominated for president by Republican elites. So to the extent that that political party and politicians are gatekeepers for our democracy, are responsible at the end of the day for keeping demagogues and authoritarians out or away from power, it's the Republican elite that failed to do it. Now, there are a bunch of criticisms that one can wage against the Democratic Party, but I think those are more mundane criticisms. We're in a situation, unfortunately, we have a two-party system. And one of the two parties over the last decade has turned away from a full commitment to democracy, which means that in order for our democracy to be safe, sadly, one party has to win. And that's too much to ask of any political party. The Democratic Party, at least as I view it, is a kind of a standard political party. It is a big, messy, pragmatic, heterogeneous, slow-moving party. It has better elections and worse elections. It makes mistakes. It has problems with its platform that it tries to adjust. It wins elections and it loses elections. And that's what happens in a democracy. In a democracy, one thing is that parties lose elections. And our democracy cannot hinge on the Democratic Party never losing elections. So at some level, yes, the Democrats have much to blame. You can blame Biden. You can blame the Democratic strategists for the 2024 defeat. But at the end of the day, a democracy has to be able to live with a party screwing up and losing an election.
Yeah. Let's talk about the essay in February, because rereading it over the weekend, it's prescient in many ways. But I also wonder, do you think? Let's talk about what's happened since January 20th and what you think you were too optimistic about, or perhaps too pessimistic, or just the catalog of when you look at the full spectrum of Trump weaponizing the government, and I think that is just the hallmark of this administration, that you just absolutely nailed the sort of most that's what describes this administration in my view. But you also put a lot of faith in three institutions that you predict are not going to go wobbly: the judiciary, the professionalized military, and I'm forgetting the third, but just the sort of constitutional order in general. You said that Trump's not going to overthrow the constitutional order,
Right.
that the judiciary and the military are, for all the obvious reasons, are bulwarks against full-blown authoritarianism. Um, and I've seen critiques, so anyway, any adjustments on any of that? Anything you think you were too optimistic on? Anything that worries you now a lot more in terms of the hybrid model you described, veering one
Yeah.
way or the other? And
Yeah.
I look, we're only sitting here in May, so it's kind of crazy that enough has happened where you might actually be able to rethink this stuff.
Well, I should say we wrote it in December. They sat on it for a little while before it came out. So we wrote it before Trump took office.
Wow.
Um,
So you wrote it. That's incredible.
and so yeah, there are a bunch of things to reflect on. First of all, we
So
didn't
you wrote it,
anticipate.
Stephen, not to interrupt you, but you wrote it before any of the first day executive orders or any of
Yes,
that.
yes,
Yeah.
weeks before that.
Yeah.
Um, but it was all pretty clear because the thing is, it was a very strange time. If you remember, the U.S. establishment was kind of done with worrying about with democracy. The overwhelming, we forget this now, but the overwhelming view in media and business and both party leadership circles was, yeah, we survived Trump 1.0. It's not going to be that bad.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but we thought from the beginning that it was very clear that it was going to be very, very, very different. One
What
thing,
what convinced you of that? Just reading the public statements he was making?
yes, and the fact that it was clear that Trump was not going to govern with any figures from the establishment, right? In 2016, when he won, Trump didn't think he was going to win. He had no plan. He had no team. He had the same authoritarian instincts, but he basically was forced to govern with more or less mainstream Republican and conservative technocrats. And those are the ones who constrained him. And Trump was very, very clear this time around that he was not going to govern with any adults in the room,
Yeah.
and that he was going to be quite unconstrained. And it was also true that it was not 100% clear to us to the degree to which he would govern with the sort of small but important ideological group that we can maybe describe as the sort of Project 2025 crowd. But there was a group, and Ross Vaught has a very important role in this administration that had a real plan this time. It was very clear that they had borrowed, they'd learned a lot from Viktor Orban. You
Hmm.
saw it a bit in Florida with uh, Governor DeSantis. But Project 2025 was all about weaponizing the state. And so to me, Trump and the people closest to him were pretty clear about what they were going to do. Now, a couple of things that we did not anticipate, several things. One, we didn't anticipate Elon Musk and Doge at all,
Hmm.
which is in a lot of ways, I mean, we still don't know where that's going, but
Yeah, we don't really know. I at least, and I try and follow this very closely, are the worst fears of what he's doing the most likely outcomes, like the catastrophic, I think it's fair to think that this is a catastrophically bad situation, but it's very it's difficult to get a full handle on it just from the publicly available information about what program, who's been fired, and right, the full spectrum of outcomes hasn't revealed itself. Is that what you would agree?
that's right. Well, first of all, I can't find any precedent for this in other cases. I mean, all of this, all the weaponization of the state that we're seeing is really, I hate to overuse this metaphor, but it's straight out of the authoritarian playbook, 21st century authoritarian playbook. Musk is not. This was new. And
Orban wouldn't have. He wouldn't have had. He wouldn't have. That's not something
no,
you would have seen there.
I mean, Orban strengthened the state. Orban loves the state. He uses the state as a weapon. This is what Republicans have learned from Hungary. The party that used to see government as the problem is now coming around to viewing government as as a very, very useful political weapon. But that's not what Doge and Musk were doing. They were breaking the machinery of government. So
Yeah.
I don't really see much of a precedent for it, and I don't understand it. I know I've heard the sort of worst case stories, and obviously the kind of data collection that illegal data collection they've engaged with is terrifying. But I just don't know where this leads. So that we
Yeah.
didn't anticipate at all. The other thing that we didn't anticipate, which is also fairly different from a lot of other contemporary authoritarian cases, is the sheer lawlessness of this government. Its willingness to just break the law until somebody stops it, which maybe we shouldn't have been surprised because Trump's in effect been doing that his whole life. But I it cannot think. I certainly can't think of a U.S. government, and I can't think of many other contemporary governments that have just had as a strategy break the law until somebody stops you.
When you
And
talk, what are the examples you think of when you think of that? Is it yeah? What are the things that are beyond the
withholding
pale?
withholding of congressionally approved funds for major universities, or the attacks on law firms. I mean, what they're doing to Harvard. I'm not a lawyer, but it's pretty clear to me is illegal. It's a violation of the law, and they may well stop when the uh, if the Supreme Court tells them to do, but they're not going to do it until they're stopped. They will knowingly break the law, and this is certainly the case with deportations. And you can create fig leaves by declaring states of emergency, etc. So some of this stuff technically is legal, and I guess Trump's accepting the gift, the plane from Qatar is legal. If Pam Bondi issues a memo saying it's legal, but I mean this is pretty open violation of the law, and that isn't part really of the competitive authoritarian playbook. And there's discussion obviously about whether at the end of the day the Trump administration will openly defy the courts. I don't think we really know that yet. Um, if it does, and I kind of suspect it probably won't, but if it does, that also will be beyond competitive authoritarianism. That is really just unconstrained authoritarianism. So in that sense, if this government continues in a lawless direction and really circumvents the courts, that's beyond anything that we predicted.
Got it. So some of the signs that you've seen since you wrote that in December are beyond what you expected. And as
Yeah.
someone who was expecting a lot of not great outcomes here.
It's also, if I can say so really quickly, it just happened much more quickly and in a much more rapidly and thoroughgoing way than we anticipated. We anticipated just about all this stuff, but I could not have expected, or did not expect, such a flurry of assaults in January, February, just right off the bat.
This hasn't really been a big part of the first few months, but is there anything that you've seen with respect to what's going on at the Pentagon and the military that changes your view about the fact, or your prediction that the professionalized military would remain an important bulwark against authoritarianism?
Well, there's some worrying signs. I mean, it's still pretty, and I'm not an expert on this, and this there it is hard to purge and pack a highly professionalized military. There aren't a ton of examples out there um, to compare it to. It happened in Chile to an extent before the coup in 1973, but it took a while, and I think the U.S. military is more professionalized even than the Chilean military in the 1970s. So it's not going to be easy to do, but the removal of the chair of the Joint Chiefs and replacement with a guy who's pretty openly Trumpist, and the firing of the Jags it's not a good sign. It
Yeah.
shows at least there's an intent to politicize the military. I don't think we know, or I certainly don't know how successful it will be. I think it'll depend a lot on how far they're able to go. It's not going to, it'll take a while.
What about the courts? Have you been encouraged by what you've seen so far?
Generally, yes, but I think, particularly given the administration's strategy, so I think for the most part, the courts are doing the right thing. They're upholding the rule of law. They are um, blocking Trump's most egregious abuses. But first of all, it's a slow process, and a lot of damage can be done before the courts act. I mean, Trump will break many things before he's stopped by the courts. And secondly, I don't think the courts will do a perfect job. The courts can be bullied. FDR bullied the courts. The threat to circumvent the courts is terrifying for courts, because that if a government openly refuses to comply with a court order, that just shoots a bullet in the heart of the legitimacy of the court. And so courts really fear that. So a really intense chicken game between the government and the courts very often leads the court to back down, and may not back down fully, but it will back down partially. And so governments that are willing, I don't want to be giving the Trump administration advice here, but governments that are willing to play chicken can often get at least part of what they want from the courts. So I certainly am not adherent to the idea that the courts can save us. The courts will not save our democracy. They're one important arena, and they've behaved mostly as I think I expected, and have mostly ruled in a way that is protective of democracy. But without societal mobilization, without the legislature, without the political parties taking action, the courts are not enough.
All right, let's talk about these other potential bulwarks then. What is to be said about the Republican Party's response to Trump's lawlessness?
I shouldn't. I'm as trained as a political scientist. I should know better. I think we're trained to be pretty cynical about politicians, but I continue to be shocked and appalled by the degree to which Republicans will sacrifice integrity and will sacrifice democracy uh, to sustain their careers. And I still don't think we have a fully clear picture of the incentive structures facing politicians. It's a mix of political ambition, in the sense that Republicans know that, at least over the last 7 or 8 years, you cannot openly confront Trump and maintain a career in the Republican Party. So that's a big disincentive. I get that.
Yeah.
There's also, I think, a degree to which, in if you are on the right politically in the United States and you oppose Trump, there's just you're in the wilderness, right? You lose friends, you lose social networks, you lose access to other professional opportunities. And I think that sort of ostracism is also a disincentive. And then, harder to calculate, at least for me, but not insignificant, is actual physical fear of harassment, online harassment, death threats to themselves and their families. I mean, that talk about knowing that you're living in a not fully democratic environment, when Republicans are reportedly voting to acquit Trump in the Senate because they fear what might happen to them and their families if they vote to convict. That's pretty serious. But at this is, I studied Latin America. I studied political parties in Latin America. That's my first book was on that. And the Republican Party it's a very old party. It's a highly institutionalized party, one of the strongest parties really in the history of the world. It has become, in less than a decade, a personalistic party, a party dominated by a single autocratic individual. And that's something that you see occasionally in Latin America, but I have not never expected to see in the United States. And so, in that context, a Republican control over Congress means that Congress just abdicates its authority as a check on executive power. This is I don't mean to compare. The United States is nowhere near as authoritarian as Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, but that's what happened there. Chavez had a legislative majority. He dominated his political party, and so the Congress just folded up its tent and delegated authority to Hugo Chavez for a decade. And to a degree, that's what's happening here.
When I was preparing for our chat, I was trying to find the best critiques of your work. What's out there that is that pushes back about what you're arguing? And I see stuff on the left. I see, more left economic critiques that that the problem with the rise of authoritarianism is about the traditional stuff you would think it's about capitalism and corporate power. What I struggle to find, and you're probably more knowledgeable about this than I am because you probably debate people all the time, are critiques on the right. What do you encounter as the sort of conservative right wing good faith pushback of the picture that you have painted?
Well, there's one critique which I think is over the book during Trump's first term, which I think is a little weaker now, which is that we were just overstating the case. That you know, Trump is kind of a thug and a demagogue and a liar, but calling this authoritarian and sort of predicting the breakdown of U.S. democracy was a couple steps too far. I think Yuval Levin wrote a piece sort of centering that critique. That's legitimate enough, certainly for Trump's first term.
Yeah,
The dominant critique I've seen now is a combination of a couple of things. First, that come on, none of this stuff is new. All
Democrats
this
do it.
what that it's been done before, that FDR did it, that Johnson and Kennedy and Nixon did it, that there's all kinds of weaponization has occurred before, and that there was a lot of weaponization by the administrative state, if not the executive branch, against right-wing political views. And
More recent.
and
I
that
understand. I understand the past. I want to talk about this. I understand the stuff from the pre Watergate. I don't know,
yeah.
pre basically Johnson era, maybe Johnson and back. I don't. But you're talking about the like Biden and Obama did it kind of argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's weaker. There's the argument, which I think is largely debunked, that the Obama administration attempted to strip uh, tax exempt status from some conservative NGOs, and
Yeah.
turns out I think it looks like some eager bureaucrats were trying to strip the tax exempt status from both left and right wing groups, and eventually pulled back. I think that story is a bit overstated, but yes, part of the argument is that Obama and Biden did. I think that's a lot weaker. The constraints on weaponization post 1974, post Nixon, are pretty strong. I mean, I think that 1974 to 2016 is far and away the most democratic period in U.S. history. So I think that critique doesn't work very well. There's a broader critique, which is that, which obviously I don't share, but that both public and private institutions in the United States have really been captured by the left since the 1960s. Some people will say the Marxist left or cultural Marxism or the woke left. Let's just call it the left. And that the U.S. bureaucracy, the administrative state, is politicized in a left-leaning direction. Private institutions, including many elite universities, are politicized in a left-leaning direction. And that what Trump is doing is is a corrective.
Yeah.
And not, it's not authoritarianism, it's a return to a more neutral, politically centered state.
Yeah. Well, I think two things can be true. I think you can agree with ideological capture of, pick your institution, and I'm not saying I endorse what you just said, but even if you did, that doesn't, to me at least, does that justify um, the the complete politicization of the government? Does that justify an executive order targeting an individual American? I mean, does that justify any of the unconstitutional actions? To me, that's they don't, those two things don't go together. Just because you think the woke mind virus, as people on the right call it, has run amok, um, that doesn't justify using the government as a cudgel to attack all of your enemies. I mean, that
But
seems.
I would take that a step further and say that that kind of logic very often is used to justify authoritarian projects. If you look at the discourse of, and yeah, I'm not calling the Republicans uh, fascist, but if you look at the discourse of in Europe in the 1930s or the Latin American military dictatorships in the 1970s, they as their justification
Yeah,
for seizing power and for repression was that institutions had been captured and corroded by the Marxists, and
yeah.
that military rule and Pinochet style repression were necessary to purge state and society of Marxism.
I mean, I'll be honest, when we're talking about the critiques on the right, the most intellectually honest arguments I see are essentially, yes, you're right. This is a form of authoritarianism and it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And as you know, there is a whole stream of thought on the right that is completely fine. It doesn't deny what you're arguing and it just endorses it as a necessary step.
Yeah, I see, yeah, and this is deeply troubling. To the U.S. right, parts of the U.S. right, increasingly inching towards that direction, just away from democracy at all, or at least liberal democracy.
And this, or so this, I know you're asked this a lot. What are the examples, because so much of your work is comparative. What are the examples of reversing democratic backsliding? What has to happen? I mean, I think we've identified the Republican Party as the sort of locus of the problem. So it seems like you got to start there. But like, what do you see as the necessary steps here for reversing this?
There are, first of all, it depends sort of how consolidated this gets. There are a lot of cases. Like Poland is maybe the most comparable case where it's really a very mild authoritarianism, and electoral institutions continue to be viable, and the small d democratic forces eventually win power back in an election. Um, that's the simplest route, and frankly, I think that's the most likely route in the United States. Now, it's unlikely that we would return to a sort of high quality, stable democracy. We may continue to kind of careen back and forth between a fairly dysfunctional democracy and soft authoritarianism. Is that the victory of the democratic forces is not necessarily the last act in the play. There may be multiple back and forth, but one way is the electoral route. That's the simplest route. Um, there are many, I would say dozens of cases in the 21st century of failed authoritarian regimes. We often, especially these days when we're so pessimistic about global democracy, we think about the Orbans and the Putins of the world, and it seems like authoritarianism is kind of taking root everywhere. It's actually not true. There are many cases of failed authoritarianism, from Yanukovych in Ukraine uh, to Sri Lanka to Bangladesh to the Gambia to Ecuador to Bolivia to Honduras. Now, these are mostly uh, much poorer countries with much weaker institutions. But autocrats fail all the time. And the fact that the Trump administration is pretty inept and is comparatively not very popular is another sort of good sign for democracy. Autocrats with 80% approval ratings like Bukele in El Salvador or Putin for quite a while during his time in office do much more damage than autocrats with 40% approval ratings. So now, if the regime were able to really consolidate, then we would be faced with something similar, more like cases where democracy is lost and you need to sort of rebuild a democracy movement from scratch, like Chile in the 1980s, etc. I don't think we'll get there. I think we're
When you say
likely.
consolidate, that
So
sounds bad. What does that mean?
I mean that at some point, democratic institutions cease to be viable channels for the opposition.
You're no longer in competitive. You're no longer in the hybrid model. You're in authoritarianism.
Right. I don't think that's going to happen in the U.S., but if it did, the way out would be different from the way I'm describing.
Got it.
As things stand, as long as judicial and electoral institutions are available, and possibly legislative institutions, as long as those channels are available, that's the principal route for the opposition to use. And I think there continues to be a good, given Trump's, I think, likely lack of success and likely limited popularity, that's the route out.
How much do you work? The thing that I have my eye on that I is what's to stop Democrats when they get back in power to sort of saying, you know what, these are the new rules. We stood up against this. We didn't like this. Our last president was literally all about trying to thwart the Democratic backsliding, but that's the only way forward. Um, I think you saw. I don't want to, I don't want to do some false equivalence between Biden and Trump, but what Biden did at the end of his term with the pardons, I understand how it was. He, in his mind, it was justifiable. It's always a tit for tat thing, and but not great. Not great that he pardoned his family members.
Totally agree.
Um, I think about, like, Kash Patel. I don't think a Democratic president in 2029, if they get in there, is going to respect the 10-year term of service for the FBI director. They're not going to be comfortable with Kash Patel. So that's a minor example, but that's another norm that's maybe out the window and justifiable in some sense. But, that what everyone agreed was an important norm for a while probably breaks down. Um, and you see some young Democratic activists who are now coming up, just saying this is how the opposition is. They're people who didn't really know a time before Trump. And what's and maybe you have some cases in other countries, but one, how much do you worry about that? Do you see other signs that I didn't mention that are concerning to you, or not?
It's a concern. And there are, whenever you have really polarized politics, you inevitably get pressure for tit for tat.
Yeah, yeah.
And you see this in every case of democratic breakdown, whether it's Chile in the early 70s or Spain in the 30s. Very common. And it ends up, both sides end up breaking the rules because they view it as self-defense. One side is breaking the rules, so you've got to do it to compete. That could happen. I think at minimum there will be a tension, which you described when you gave the example of Kash Patel. Without any question, Democrats, if all goes well and they win back a lot of power in 2028, 2029, they're going to have to deal with people who are really politicized or really corrupt or actively seeking to undermine or break the state that they're going to have to get rid of. And
who are just embedded in the executive branch now.
right. And so the Democrats will, I think, inevitably face this lose-lose choice where they have to either live with these guys in power and respect the norms or reinforce the norm breaking by purging them. And there is no perfect liberal democratic way out of that. The Polish government is facing this, has been confronting this over the last couple of years. It's really hard. And maybe we can learn some lessons from them, but it is difficult. There's no easy way out of that. So that is going to happen, and it will reinforce the erosion of our norms. So there's no way in hell that we're going to return to like a 1980s, 1990s quality democracy, at least not overnight. It's going to be messy, without question. Our institutions will be weakened, and they will not be rebuilt easily, precisely for the reason that you give. That said, I think it's less likely that the Democrats mimic the Republicans in a sort of full thoroughgoing way. There's all kinds of discussion about we need our Trump, we need our Elon Musk, we have to play like them. I think there are a couple of reasons why you won't see that, or why it's not that likely. One, the Democratic Party's constituency is very different.
Yeah,
Democratic Party is an urban, college-educated, cosmopolitan party that is fundamentally liberal.
Yeah.
And that's not going to change. There may be people on the left wing of the party or some elements of the party who'd be enthusiastic about sort of demagogic illiberalism, but it's just not going to sell with most of the constituencies of the party. The party, given its very heterogeneous mix of college-educated folks and ethnic minorities, I think it's condemned to liberalism. I really cannot see it following an illiberal path. The other argument, which I hold out some hope for the Republicans here too, is neither side in this country is capable of killing the other. You may be able to win and abuse power for a few years, but it's going to be really difficult to knock out the other side and gain hegemony. And I think that it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize eventually that you're better off with a set of rules and norms in place that prevent each side from abusing power than going. I don't know how many iterations we'll have to go through. We may have to careen 2, 3, 4 times, but eventually, I think, given that neither side is going away, that the parties will realize that that tit for tat just is not going to get them anywhere. And I think, in part, Democratic politicians know that.
Hi, Steve, unless you have to jump off, because I don't want to take you, because we killed some time with some tech issues. I just wanted to ask you one question about the media.
Sure.
You got time? I think if you adopt a framework even close to the one that you have adopted and described, it really does change your view about how to cover the two parties, how to cover politics. I have noticed in the last decade in newsrooms that it's really uncomfortable for a lot of reporters to view this system the way that you've described. As you know, there's a lot of debate about your ideas. That it's not that like it's excluded in any way. There's lots of conversation about it, but I mean, if you come to the conclusions, even close to the conclusions that you've come to, to me, it has profound implications for how the media does its job that have not been as widespread as one would expect. And I'm just curious what your view is on that. And if you were to start a news entity these days, what would you have it focus on? But let's talk about that first part of it as well. Like, what are the implications if newsroom leaders viewed the two parties in the way that you've described, in an empirical way, not in some ideological partisan way, um, but that is kind of how it's viewed in a lot of newsrooms. Is that if you think the Republican Party has, if you describe it the way that you have described it, if you describe Trump the way that you've described it, that is in a sense a partisan view and is sort of not kosher.
Yeah, look, there's a reason why I'm not founding a newsroom. It's a really difficult dilemma. And so just leaving aside the challenges that, say, CBS newsrooms are facing these days, the pressure from this administration, leaving that aside,
Yeah.
we've got two generations, maybe three, yeah, I guess two generations of journalists who were trained in sort of mid to late 20th century journalistic norms. We have a two-party system, and we're supposed to be, to use a, a Fox News's term, fair and balanced between both sides. And
Yeah.
it is inevitable in a two-party system when one party is turned, if you accept the premise that one party is turned away from democracy, it's inevitable that that coverage of the Republicans as authoritarian is viewed as partisan. I mean, I get attacked all the time for being a partisan hack, and it's very difficult for me to establish, and I'm not even a journalist, uh, any authority separate from this sort of partisan fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no easy way. I do think that there are better and worse ways to go about it. And I do think, and the New York Times gets pilloried for this, and not always fairly, but sometimes fairly, for this effort to kind of downplay the authoritarianism and sort of normalize, instead of breaking the law, they're pushing the boundaries, and it's a debate rather than assault on democracy.
Right.
I think ultimately that is dangerous. I think journalists can be professional and fair and balanced without being bipartisan in a world in which one party is authoritarian and one party is not. I mean, again, I could be wrong, and the Republicans may not be an authoritarian party, but if they are, it's really important that they get called as such. Really dangerous to not do that. It's really, this is an overused term, but it's really dangerous to normalize authoritarianism. So
Yeah.
what journalists can do is they can relentlessly go after Democrats. You pointed to the Biden pardon. There are all sorts of abuses and wrongdoings and mistakes that journalists should be going after Democrats for. It's the model, the sort of MSNBC model of defending the Democrats at all costs because you get into this partisan game, I think is a big mistake. But so I think at the same time that journalists continue to hold Democrats rigorously accountable and continue to give voice to multiple views, including conservative views that are not necessarily Trumpist. I think one could do that and still call authoritarianism.
Yeah. I mean, look, not bending over backwards to call something that it's not because you think you're being fair is worse than I mean, not calling something what it is, hiding the truth in a sense is a whole lot worse in my view. Steve,
I agree. Yeah.
thank you so much for doing this. Anything we didn't cover that you wanna talk about here at the end?
No, just to reflecting on that last point, it's really tough. I mean, it's very easy to criticize the media, and there's much to criticize. But journalists, particularly journalists who were trained in a different era, who learned sort of good journalism in a different era, this was not an easy challenge.
Yeah.
and it's there's not an easy solution to it.
Yeah, the conventions they've have been weaponized against us and sort of hacked by this movement, and
But even
it's
if we're
difficult.
not wedded to those conventions, there's not a simple way to handle this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the problem of of being pro democracy, it sounds people joke all in newsrooms, the resistance and being pro-democracy, these have turned into partisan pejorative words, because the way that everything gets polarized and everything gets funneled into a Democrat Republican debate. And no, I agree with you. It's not easy. I guess the final thing is, you know, in covering this administration, given what you've described, what do you think's the most important, parts to cover? What do you think the focus should be on? What do you think the sort of, if you were in control of resources in a newsroom, like, what's the how would you advise people to keep their eye on the big picture, and not get distracted by the little things? Like, what's important in terms of that mission?
Hmm. Uh, I'm gonna largely punt on this, but I really mean what I'm saying. I don't think that there's a single thing. I actually think a lot of journalists are doing a quite a good job. I mean, I think highlighting individual abuses is really important, and so continuing to tell the stories of those who were wrongfully detained and wrongfully deported, and 4-year-old children with cancer, U.S. citizens or children who are deported to Central America. That coverage is incredibly important. Uh, Actually, doing the homework and looking at the list and figuring out how many people were actually criminals when they're deported, super important. The corruption, I the corruption, I think, in this administration is is so far beyond anything we've seen in modern American history. Um, and it's incredibly important not to sort of normalize or accept that, or to kind of define deviancy down in that way. So continue to report on the Trump family and how it's making money, how Trump is making money out of the presidency, is incredibly important. And I think that the media, uh, maybe because I'm not a journalist, I give you guys more of a pass than sometimes you give yourselves. But I think you're a lot of journalists out there doing a good job.
No, no, I agree with that absolutely. All the details that we're talking about in this conversation came from, not all of them, but many of them came from excellent reporting,
Exactly.
um, you know, in the Times and other places. Thank you for doing this, Steve. I really appreciate it. It's an excellent conversation. Hope we can do it again in a few months and get a sort of status update.
Sure. Happy
All
to
right.
do it. Take care.
Take care. All right. Bye bye.